The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Arizona desert as Captain Thomas Mitchell adjusted his field glasses. For 3 months, his cavalry unit had been chasing the Apache war chief Geronimo and his band of warriors through the most unforgiving terrain in the American Southwest. Every time they thought they had cornered the elusive group, the Apache seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind only hoofprints that led to nowhere. Mitchell lowered his glasses and wiped the sweat from his brow. The year was 1885, and the Apache Wars had been raging for decades. The U.S. Army had superior numbers, better weapons, and endless supplies, yet a small group of Apache warriors continued to outmaneuver them at every turn. It was becoming an embarrassment to the military, and pressure was mounting from Washington to end this conflict once and for all. "Sir, the scouts have returned," announced Sergeant Williams, approaching on horseback. His uniform was caked with dust and his horse showed signs of hard riding. "They found tracks heading toward Eagle Peak, but then they just disappear again." Mitchell cursed under his breath. This was the 4th time this week that Apache tracks had simply vanished. It was as if the earth itself was swallowing them whole. The local settlers were growing more frightened by the day, and the newspapers back east were calling the Army incompetent. Something had to give. What the Army didn't know was that just 20 miles away, hidden within the heart of Eagle Peak itself, Geronimo and his people were living in complete safety. The Apache had discovered something that would change the course of their resistance against the encroaching white settlers. Deep within the mountain, accessible only through a narrow crack in the rock face that was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, lay a vast network of caves. These weren't ordinary caves. They had been carved by centuries of water flow, creating a labyrinth of chambers and tunnels that stretched for miles underground. The Apache had stumbled upon this natural fortress during a desperate flight from pursuing soldiers 2 years earlier. What they found inside took their breath away. The main chamber was enormous, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. Fresh water flowed from natural springs, creating small pools that reflected the light from their torches. The air was cool and clean, a welcome relief from the scorching desert heat outside. Most importantly, there were multiple exits scattered throughout the mountain range, some emerging miles away from the main entrance. Geronimo had immediately recognized the strategic value of this discovery. Here was a place where his people could live safely, store supplies, and plan their resistance without fear of discovery. The entrance was so well hidden that even other Apache tribes didn't know of its existence. From the outside, Eagle Peak looked like solid rock, giving no hint of the bustling community that lived within its heart. The Apache quickly adapted to their underground life. They carved sleeping areas into the cave walls and created storage chambers for food and weapons. They learned to move silently through the tunnels, using hand signals to communicate in the echoing darkness. Children played in the vast chambers while their parents planned raids and defensive strategies. But the most remarkable discovery came when they explored deeper into the cave system. Following a narrow passage that seemed to lead nowhere, scouts found that it opened into another mountain entirely. This second peak was over 5 miles away from Eagle Peak, yet the two were connected by a natural tunnel that the Apache could traverse in complete secrecy. This network of hidden passages became the backbone of Apache resistance. Warriors could disappear into Eagle Peak during a battle, travel underground for hours, and emerge from a completely different mountain to attack the army from behind. Supply lines that the soldiers thought were secure suddenly came under assault from directions that seemed impossible. Captain Mitchell and his men had no idea they were dealing with an enemy that could literally disappear into the earth. They continued their futile searches, following tracks that led to dead ends, pursuing shadows that melted away into the desert heat. Meanwhile, the Apache watched them from hidden vantage points, learning their patterns and planning their next moves. The secret of the Strongholds was carefully guarded. Only the most trusted Apache warriors knew the exact locations of all the entrances. Maps were never drawn, and the knowledge was passed down through whispered conversations and careful guidance. Even captured Apache warriors could not reveal what they did not fully know. As weeks turned to months, the existence of these hidden strongholds allowed the Apache to maintain their resistance far longer than anyone thought possible. They had found a way to make the very landscape their ally, using the earth itself as both shield and sword in their fight for survival. The army continued their searches, never suspecting that their quarry was often watching them from caves hidden in plain sight. waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. 3 weeks after the failed pursuit near Eagle Peak, Private James Norton was assigned to a new reconnaissance mission. Unlike the other soldiers in his unit, Norton had grown up on the frontier and possessed an unusual talent for reading the land. His grandmother had been part Cherokee, and she had taught him to notice things that others missed. The way grass bent differently when someone had passed through, how rocks were displaced by footsteps, and most importantly, how to feel when something wasn't quite right. As Norton rode through a narrow canyon called Devil's Backbone, something caught his attention. The walls of the canyon were solid rock, worn smooth by countless years of flash floods. But there was something odd about one section. While the rest of the canyon wall showed the horizontal layers typical of sedimentary rock, one area seemed different. The rock face appeared too perfect, too uniform. Dismounting from his horse, Norton approached the suspicious area. He ran his hands along the rock surface and felt his heart skip a beat. What looked like solid stone was actually a carefully constructed barrier. Thin slabs of rock had been fitted together so precisely that from even a few feet away, they appeared to be part of the natural canyon wall. Behind this false front, Norton could feel air movement and hear the faint sound of dripping water. Norton had discovered one of the smaller Apache hideouts, a supply depot connected to the main stronghold by a tunnel system. The Apache had spent months perfecting this camouflage, studying how the canyon walls naturally weathered and matching their construction to blend seamlessly with the surroundings. They had even transplanted desert plants to grow over parts of the barrier, making the deception complete. Realizing the magnitude of his discovery, Norton carefully marked the location in his mind and rode back to report to Captain Mitchell. But his report was met with skepticism. The idea that the Apache could construct such elaborate hiding places seemed impossible to officers who viewed them as primitive savages. Mitchell listened politely but filed the report away, more concerned with conventional military tactics than investigating what seemed like the wild imagination of a frontier-raised private. Meanwhile, inside the main stronghold at Eagle Peak, the Apache were facing their own challenges. Living underground for extended periods was taking its toll on both warriors and families. Children who had grown up under the open sky were beginning to show signs of illness from the lack of sunlight. Food supplies, while adequate, required constant replenishment through dangerous raids on supply trains and settlements. Chief among their concerns was the problem of smoke. Cooking fires were essential for survival, but smoke could give away their position to any observant army patrol. The Apache had solved this problem through ingenious engineering. They discovered that certain chambers in the cave system had natural chimneys that led to openings hidden high on the mountain faces, places where wisps of smoke would be invisible against the sky or would be mistaken for natural rock formations. But perhaps their greatest challenge was maintaining the psychological warfare that had proven so effective against the army. The Apache understood that their greatest weapon wasn't just their ability to hide, but their ability to appear and disappear at will, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty among their enemies. They needed to strike a balance between staying hidden and maintaining their reputation as an unstoppable force. This is where the tunnel system proved invaluable. The Apache had mapped every passage, every chamber, and every exit point. They knew which routes were large enough for horses and which required travel on foot. They had established supply caches at strategic points and created emergency escape routes that could be used if any entrance was discovered. The complexity of their underground network was staggering. The main tunnel connecting Eagle Peak to the secondary mountain was large enough for a man on horseback, but it required navigating several chambers where the ceiling dropped low enough to force riders to dismount. Side passages led to smaller caves that served as lookout points, accessible through carefully hidden openings that provided panoramic views of the surrounding desert. One of these lookout points had been carved behind what appeared to be a natural shadow on the rock face. From inside the cave, Apache scouts could observe army movements for miles in every direction while remaining completely invisible. The opening was positioned so that the angle of the sun never directly illuminated the interior, maintaining the illusion of solid rock. The Apache had also discovered that the cave system included natural acoustic properties that allowed them to communicate over long distances. Whispers spoken in certain chambers could be heard clearly in caves miles away, creating an underground communication network that rivaled anything the army possessed. This allowed them to coordinate movements and share intelligence without ever exposing themselves to detection. As Norton's report gathered dust in Captain Mitchell's files, the Apache continued to refine their use of the Strongholds. They developed a complex system of signals using reflected sunlight from concealed mirrors, allowing surface scouts to communicate with those hidden underground. They created false trails that led Army patrols away from the real entrances while simultaneously gathering intelligence on troop movements and supply schedules. The psychological impact of these tactics was devastating to Army morale. Soldiers began to question whether they were fighting human enemies or ghosts. Reports of Apache warriors appearing from solid rock and disappearing into thin air spread through the ranks, creating an atmosphere of superstition and fear that no amount of military discipline could completely suppress. The discovery that would change everything came from an unexpected source. Maria Gonzalez was a Mexican woman who had been captured by the Apache during a raid 6 months earlier. Unlike many captives who were eventually released or escaped, Maria had begun to earn the trust of her captors through her knowledge of herbal medicine and her quiet acceptance of her situation. She had saved the life of an Apache child during a fever outbreak, and gradually, the barriers between captive and captor had begun to dissolve. Maria was one of the few outsiders ever allowed to see the interior of the main stronghold. The Apache had grown to trust her enough to bring her into the caves when Army patrols came too close to their temporary surface camps. What she witnessed inside Eagle Peak would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't seen it with their own eyes. The main chamber had been transformed into a thriving underground community. Apache families had created distinct living areas using hanging blankets and carefully arranged rocks. Children played quiet games while adults worked on weapons and tools by the light of carefully tended fires. The air circulation system the Apache had developed was so effective that the caves never felt stuffy or smoky, despite housing over 200 people. But it was the engineering accomplishments that truly amazed Maria. The Apache had carved channels to direct the flow of underground streams, creating a reliable water distribution system throughout the cave complex. They had built elevated platforms for sleeping that kept people dry during the seasonal flooding that occurred when heavy rains filled the underground watercourses. Most impressively, they had discovered and excavated natural crystal formations that could be polished to reflect and amplify torchlight, illuminating vast chambers with a surprisingly small number of flames. Maria also learned about the spiritual significance of the caves to the Apache people. These weren't just hiding places. They were sacred spaces where the tribe could maintain their connection to the earth spirits that played such an important role in their beliefs. The Apache saw their ability to disappear into the mountains as proof that the land itself was protecting them from their enemies. Ceremonies were held in certain chambers that had exceptional acoustic properties, where chanted prayers seemed to echo with supernatural power. The woman's growing integration into Apache society gave her access to information that would have been invaluable to the Army. But Maria found herself facing an impossible choice. She had initially hoped to escape and return to her family, but months of living with the Apache had shown her a side of the conflict that she had never understood. These weren't the savage raiders that Mexican and American newspapers portrayed. They were families fighting desperately to protect their way of life and their children's future. During her time in the caves, Maria witnessed the careful planning that went into every Apache operation. Nothing was left to chance. Before any raid or movement, scouts would spend days observing Army patrols and mapping their routes. The Apache had developed an intelligence network that extended far beyond their hidden strongholds, with sympathetic Native Americans from other tribes providing information about troop movements and supply schedules. The logistics of maintaining the hidden community were staggering. Food had to be gathered from the desert during carefully planned expeditions that avoided all contact with Army patrols. Water, while abundant from the underground springs, had to be carefully managed during dry seasons. Weapons and ammunition required constant maintenance and occasional replenishment through raids on isolated outposts. Maria learned that the Apache had established multiple supply caches throughout the desert, hidden in locations that looked completely natural, but were actually carefully constructed storage sites. These caches contained not just food and weapons, but also materials needed for maintaining their underground community: tools for carving stone, materials for making torches, and medicine for treating injuries and illnesses. The most remarkable aspect of the Apache operation was their ability to maintain complete secrecy while moving large numbers of people through the desert. They had developed techniques for traveling that left virtually no trace. Large groups would split into smaller units that took different routes to the same destination, reconvening only after ensuring they hadn't been followed. They could move an entire family through rocky terrain without disturbing a single stone or leaving a footprint that could be detected by army trackers. But the psychological pressure of living in hiding was enormous. Apache culture had always emphasized the importance of living in harmony with the natural world, and being forced underground went against fundamental beliefs about the proper relationship between humans and the earth. Some of the older Apache spoke of this time as a test from the spirits, a trial that would determine whether their people deserved to survive as a free nation. The children adapted more easily to underground life, but their adaptation worried the adults. Young Apache were growing up without the traditional experiences that had shaped their culture for generations. They couldn't learn to read the weather patterns or track animals in their natural environment. The skills that had made the Apache such formidable desert warriors were in danger of being lost to a generation raised in caves. Maria also observed the constant tension between the need for security and the desire for freedom. Every decision had to be weighed against the risk of discovery. Even simple activities like gathering medicinal plants or hunting small game required extensive planning and coordination. The Apache were winning their war against the army, but they were paying a price that went far beyond the casualties of battle. As autumn approached, Maria found herself deeply conflicted. She had been given opportunities to escape, but each time she chose to remain with the Apache. She had become part of their community in ways that she never expected, and the thought of betraying their trust by revealing the location of the strongholds became increasingly unthinkable. Yet she also knew that the current situation couldn't continue indefinitely. Something would have to give, and when it did, the consequences would be felt by everyone involved in this deadly game of hide and seek. The crisis that everyone had been dreading finally arrived on a cold November morning. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Hayes had been brought in from Washington specifically to end the Apache problem once and for all. Unlike the previous commanders who had treated this as a conventional military campaign, Hayes understood that he was dealing with an enemy who had mastered the art of unconventional warfare. His reputation had been built on his ability to think like his opponents, and he brought a methodical approach that would prove far more dangerous than anything the Apache had faced before. Hayes's first action was to interview every soldier who had served in the Apache campaigns, paying particular attention to reports that had been dismissed by previous commanders. When he read Private Norton's account of the false rock wall and Devil's Backbone, Hayes didn't dismiss it as imagination. Instead, he ordered a thorough investigation of the site, bringing along military engineers who specialized in fortification and concealment. What they found confirmed Norton's report and revealed the sophistication of Apache engineering. The false wall was just the beginning. Behind it lay a carefully constructed supply depot that connected to a much larger tunnel system. The engineers marveled at the precision of the stonework and the ingenious ventilation system that kept the air fresh, without creating detectable airflow at the entrance. But Hayes was more interested in what the discovery revealed about Apache capabilities than in the engineering itself. If they could construct one such hideout, there were certainly others. More importantly, the existence of these hidden facilities suggested that the Apache weren't just surviving in the desert, they were thriving. This explained how they had been able to maintain their resistance for so long, despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Hayes began to map every reported Apache sighting and disappearance, looking for patterns that his predecessors had missed. What emerged was a picture that changed his understanding of the entire conflict. The Apache weren't randomly moving through the desert as he had initially assumed. Their movements followed specific patterns that suggested they were operating from fixed bases that remained hidden from army observation. The breakthrough came when Hayes plotted all the disappearance sites on a detailed topographical map, most of them clustered around specific geographical features, isolated peaks, box canyons, and areas where the desert floor was broken by extensive rock formations. These weren't random hiding places. They were carefully selected positions that offered both concealment and strategic advantages. Eagle Peak appeared on Hayes's map as the center of a web of Apache activity. Raids seemed to radiate outward from this location, and several pursuit forces had lost Apache trails in the vicinity of the mountain. Yet every reconnaissance mission to the area had found nothing but solid rock and empty desert. Hayes began to suspect that the Apache had found something at Eagle Peak that his forces hadn't discovered. Inside the stronghold, the Apache were also facing new challenges. The discovery of the supply depot at Devil's Backbone had forced them to abandon several outlying positions and consolidate their forces in the main cave system. This concentration of people put strain on their resources and increased the risk that the entire community could be discovered if the army found the right entrance. Geronimo and his war chiefs held constant strategy, meetings in the deepest chamber of the cave system, debating whether to abandon the strongholds and return to their traditional nomadic lifestyle. The caves had given them enormous tactical advantages, but they were becoming a trap as well as a sanctuary. If the army ever found the main entrance, the Apache would be cornered with limited escape routes. The discussion was complicated by the presence of families within the stronghold. Warriors could move quickly and live off the land, but children and elderly members of the tribe needed the security and resources that only the cave system could provide. Abandoning the strongholds would mean exposing the most vulnerable members of their community to the dangers of constant pursuit and harsh desert conditions. Maria Gonzalez found herself in an increasingly difficult position as tension within the Apache community grew. Some warriors viewed her with suspicion, believing that her presence increased the risk of discovery. Others had come to see her as a valuable member of their community, whose medical knowledge had saved lives. The debate over her status reflected larger questions about trust and security that were dividing the Apache. Leadership. The pressure intensified when Apache scouts reported that army patrols were becoming more systematic in their searches. Instead of chasing rumors and following false trails, the soldiers were now conducting methodical surveys of potential hiding places. They were using new techniques that the Apache hadn't encountered before, including the use of mirrors to signal between different observation points and the systematic mapping of all caves and rock formations in the area. Hayes had also brought in civilian experts to assist with the search, geologists who understood rock formations and mining engineers who knew how to detect artificial excavations joined the military effort. These specialists could identify signs that pure military men might miss, subtle changes in vegetation that indicated underground water sources, patterns of erosion that suggested hidden openings, and other clues that pointed to the existence of concealed spaces. The Apache responded by increasing their security measures. They posted more lookouts and developed new protocols for concealing evidence of their presence. All movement in and out of the strongholds was restricted to small groups that traveled only during specific weather conditions when visibility was limited. They also began preparing emergency evacuation plans that would allow them to abandon the caves quickly if discovery became imminent. But the greatest threat came from an unexpected direction. Hayes had begun recruiting Apache from other tribes who had made peace with the government, offering them significant rewards for information about Geronimo's hiding places. These scouts understood Apache methods and could read signs that white soldiers would never notice. Their involvement in the search effort represented a fundamental change in the nature of the conflict, turning what had been a war between cultures into a struggle within the Apache nation itself. As winter approached, both sides prepared for what many believed would be the final phase of the Apache Wars. The hidden strongholds had given the Apache an unprecedented advantage, but that advantage was slowly being eroded by more sophisticated search techniques and the involvement of Apache scouts who understood their methods. The outcome would depend on whether Hayes could locate the strongholds before the Apache decided to abandon them and return to their traditional way of life. The betrayal came from within, but not in the way anyone expected. Tom Jeffords, a former Army scout who had lived among the Apache for several years, approached Colonel Hayes with an offer that would change the course of the war. Jeffords had earned the respect of many Apache leaders through his fair dealings and his genuine understanding of their culture. He claimed to know the general location of the main Apache stronghold, but he had conditions for sharing this information. Jeffords demanded that any assault on the strongholds be conducted in a way that minimized casualties among Apache women and children. He also insisted on being present during any negotiations that might result from the discovery of the hidden caves. Hayes, desperate for results and facing increasing pressure from Washington, agreed to these terms, though he had no intention of honoring them once he had the information he needed. What Jeffords revealed sent shockwaves through the Army command. The Apache hadn't just found a few caves to hide in. They had discovered and developed an underground city that could house hundreds of people. The main stronghold at Eagle Peak was connected to multiple other locations through a tunnel system that extended for miles underground. The Apache could move their entire community from one mountain to another without ever appearing on the surface. But Jeffords had his own agenda. Rather than betraying the Apache, he was attempting to save them from what he saw as an inevitable discovery. He knew that Hayes's systematic approach would eventually locate the strongholds, and when that happened, the result would be a massacre. By revealing the location himself, he hoped to force a negotiated settlement that would allow the Apache to surrender with dignity rather than fight to the death in their underground fortress. The information from Jeffords allowed Hayes to understand why his forces had been so unsuccessful in their pursuit of the Apache. Every time they thought they had cornered Geronimo's band, the Apache had simply disappeared underground and emerged miles away through a different entrance. The Army had been fighting an enemy that could literally vanish into the earth and reappear anywhere. Within a vast area, Hayes immediately began planning an operation to surround all known entrances to the cave system simultaneously. This would require careful coordination between multiple units and perfect timing to prevent the Apache from escaping through exits that hadn't been discovered. He brought in additional troops and began intensive reconnaissance of Eagle Peak and the surrounding mountains, looking for any sign of concealed openings. Inside the stronghold, the Apache sensed that something had changed. The increased Army activity around Eagle Peak was impossible to ignore, and scouts reported that soldiers were examining rock formations with unusual intensity. Geronimo and his war chiefs realized that their secret was no longer safe, but they faced an agonizing decision about how to respond. Some warriors advocated for immediate evacuation, arguing that they should abandon the strongholds before they were discovered and return to traditional nomadic tactics. Others believed that the caves gave them such a significant defensive advantage that they should stay and fight, making the Army pay dearly for any attempt to assault their position. A third group, led by some of the older chiefs, began to discuss the possibility of negotiated surrender if they could secure guarantees for the safety of their families. The debate was complicated by the presence of Maria Gonzalez, who had become deeply integrated into the Apache community during her months in captivity. She had witnessed the construction of additional defensive positions within the caves and understood better than most outsiders how formidable the stronghold would be if attacked. But she also knew that the Apache couldn't remain hidden forever, and she feared that any military assault would result in massive casualties on both sides. Maria found herself in an impossible position when several Apache warriors approached her with a proposal. They wanted her to leave the stronghold and make contact with the Army, offering to serve as an intermediary in negotiations for peaceful surrender. The Apache had come to trust her judgment and believed that she could present their situation in a way that might prevent a devastating battle. But leaving the stronghold meant abandoning people who had become like family to her. The Apache children who had initially been frightened of her now sought her out for comfort and medical care. The women who had taught her their traditional crafts and included her in their daily activities had shown her kindness that she had never expected from her captors. Walking away from the caves felt like betraying everyone who had come to depend on her. The tension within the stronghold increased when scouts reported that the Army was bringing in special equipment, mirrors for long-distance signaling, ropes and climbing gear for scaling cliff faces, and what appeared to be explosives that could be used to blast open concealed entrances. Hayes was clearly planning a comprehensive assault that would eliminate any possibility of escape through the tunnel. System Geronimo made the difficult decision to begin evacuation preparations while continuing to hope for a peaceful resolution. Essential supplies were moved to the most remote sections of the cave system, and emergency escape routes were prepared for use if the main entrances were compromised. Warriors were assigned to defensive positions that would allow them to hold off an assault long enough for families to escape through the tunnel network. The engineering challenges of defending the stronghold were enormous. The Apache had to balance the need for defensive positions with the requirement to maintain secrecy. They couldn't build obvious fortifications that would reveal the location of entrances, but they also needed to be prepared for the possibility of a siege. Their solution was to create defensive positions that looked like natural rock formations from the outside, but could be quickly converted to fighting positions if needed. As December arrived, both sides prepared for what many believed would be the final confrontation of the Apache Wars. The hidden strongholds had allowed the Apache to wage an incredibly effective guerrilla campaign, but the advantages of concealment were being eroded by systematic army tactics and improved intelligence gathering. The outcome would depend on whether the Apache could maintain their secrecy long enough to negotiate a favorable surrender or whether they would be forced to make their final stand in the underground fortress they had created. The irony wasn't lost on either side that this conflict between two cultures would likely be decided in a place that represented the Apache's most successful adaptation to the challenges of modern warfare. The caves that had given them such an advantage might also become their final battleground. The end came not with the thunderous assault that both sides had expected, but with a quiet conversation in the pre-dawn darkness of a cold December morning. Maria Gonzalez had made her choice. She left the stronghold through one of the smaller exits and walked directly to the army camp, carrying a message from Geronimo that would change the course of history. The Apache leader was offering to negotiate, but only under specific conditions. He wanted guarantees that his people would be treated as prisoners of war rather than criminals, that families would not be separated, and that the Apache would be allowed to maintain some of their cultural practices even in captivity. Most importantly, he demanded that the location of the strongholds remain secret, arguing that knowledge of their existence would only lead to their eventual discovery by treasure hunters and curiosity seekers who would desecrate the sacred spaces within the caves. Colonel Hayes found himself facing a dilemma that he hadn't anticipated. The military glory of capturing the hidden strongholds would cement his reputation and likely lead to promotion, but the practical benefits of a negotiated surrender were enormous. Continued fighting would be costly in both lives and resources, and there was no guarantee that an assault on the caves would be successful. The Apache had chosen their defensive positions well, and attacking them would require exposing his soldiers to significant danger. The negotiations took place in a neutral location several miles from Eagle Peak, with Maria serving as translator and mediator. What emerged from these discussions was a grudging respect between Hayes and Geronimo, two military leaders who recognized each other's tactical abilities, despite being on opposite sides of a brutal conflict. Geronimo explained that the discovery of the strongholds had been accidental, the result of desperate flight from pursuing soldiers rather than any planned strategy. But once the Apache realized what they had found, they understood that these hidden spaces represented their best hope for maintaining their independence in a world that was rapidly changing around them. The caves had given them the ability to strike back against overwhelming odds and protect their families from the violence that had consumed the Southwest for decades. Hayes, for his part, admitted that the Apache had achieved something remarkable in their use of the strongholds. They had turned the landscape itself into a weapon, using their knowledge of the desert and their engineering skills to create defensive positions that had baffled professional soldiers for months. The psychological impact of their apparent ability to vanish into thin air had been as important as any tactical advantage they had gained. The final agreement, reached between the two leaders, reflected the complex realities of their situation. The Apache would surrender and accept relocation to a reservation, but in exchange the army would agree to certain concessions that recognized their status as a sovereign people rather than mere rebels. The strongholds would be sealed and their locations kept secret, allowing the Apache to maintain some connection to the sacred spaces they had created. But the most remarkable aspect of the agreement was what it revealed about the transformation that had taken place during the months of hidden warfare. Both the Apache and the Army had learned lessons that would influence their understanding of conflict for years to come. The Apache had demonstrated that superior numbers and equipment could be overcome through ingenuity, determination, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Army had learned that defeating an enemy required understanding their methods and motivations rather than simply applying overwhelming force. Maria Gonzalez chose to remain with the Apache during their relocation, having found among them a sense of community and purpose that she had never experienced in her previous life. Her role as intermediary had evolved into something much deeper, and she had become a bridge between two cultures that had been locked in deadly conflict. Her presence among the Apache helped ease the transition to reservation life and provided a living reminder of the possibility for understanding between different peoples. The Strongholds themselves were carefully sealed using techniques that the Apache had developed during their occupation. The entrances were blocked with stones that were fitted so precisely that they appeared to be part of the natural rock formations. Over time, desert vegetation grew over these concealed openings, making them virtually impossible to detect. The secret of their locations was kept by a small group of Apache elders who passed the knowledge down through oral tradition, ensuring that future generations would know where their ancestors had made their greatest stand. Years later, when historians and archaeologists began to study the Apache Wars, they struggled to understand how such a small group of warriors had been able to resist the U.S. Army for so long. The official records made no mention of the hidden strongholds, and the participants in the conflict had kept their promise to maintain secrecy about the cave's existence. It wasn't until decades later that fragments of the true story began to emerge through interviews with elderly Apache who had lived through those desperate months. Underground, the legacy of the hidden strongholds extended far beyond the immediate conflict. Military strategists studied the Apache tactics and incorporated lessons about guerrilla warfare and the use of terrain into their training programs. Engineers marveled at the sophistication of the underground construction and the ingenious solutions the Apache had developed for problems of ventilation, water management, and concealment. But perhaps the most important legacy was the demonstration that even in the face of overwhelming odds, human ingenuity and determination could create possibilities that seemed impossible. The Apache had taken a natural feature of the landscape and transformed it into something that served their needs, proving that survival often depended more on creativity and adaptability than on superior firepower. The strongholds remained hidden, their secret preserved by the very people who had once used them as weapons of war. In the end, the greatest victory of the Apache wasn't their ability to fight from concealment, but their success in protecting the sacred spaces they had created from those who would exploit or destroy them. The mountains kept their secrets, and the ghosts of Eagle Peak continued to guard the memory of a people who had refused to surrender, without making the desert itself their ally in the fight for freedom.